and welcome to your very own financial planner, where we at BTVI will help you plan your finances better. Joining us today in the studio is Feroze Azeez, Deputy CEO of Anand Rathi. Thanks, Feroze. Thanks for joining us. I guess it would be only fair to start a show called Financial Planner by discussing what is financial planning. So first up, Feroze, tell us, what is financial planning? You're a veteran in the industry. I think you know it better than most of us do. What is financial planning?
I think Samina rightly said, financial planning is one of the aspects of actually trying to encompass the entire life cycle, from earning money to saving money to spending it to meeting your goals to transmitting it. So it's the holistic process of starting one's financial life from one point to the other one. So this whole process is called financial planning, and the more it is thought of, it's more it's planned and it's not ad hoc, the better the life cycle is, and it's more fruitful that way.
Feroze, how important is this? Because if you go back 10 years ago, most people didn't even know what a financial plan looked like. As, of course, time progresses, as millennials get into the cycle, we hear about financial planning a lot more. I'm guessing you feel the same about your business, where interest is a lot more. We see the robustness in equity markets. So clearly it is catching a lot more attention. Is this really important?
In my opinion, of course, it's very important. It's important for 3-4 reasons. The first is, if you plan your money right, this gives you an armory to plan the rest of it right. Second, this is one thing which a person doesn't have a choice, right? Because he is going to be earning money and he's going to be spending money. It's other subjects a person can actually take a back seat and say, I'm not interested. But money is an integral part of life, and it's as important as it could get. If planning cannot be extrapolated to money, then what's planning best for? I think money is what it's most important for. Third, the world is very dynamic. How earlier it used to be was not as dynamic as it would be. So we would spend decades investing in real estate, and that's the end of it.
Right.
But I think it's become far more dynamic, and there's so much more for a person to go up the learning curve like the global markets would have. So I think you rightly pointed out, the Indians are actually having a huge interest, and I think actually there's a paradigm shift in the interest levels of financial planning.
Right. Feroze, financial planning is not limited to just investing, right? So earn, save, invest, spend. The whole gamut comes under financial planning. Is that a fair assumption? Because if we say financial planning, most assume we are talking about investments.
Absolutely. I think investments is a part of it, of course, a reasonable part of it, but I think it's significantly more. Financial planning is not just investing. It's about protecting you against several risks which come your way during this life cycle. And then it's also about, we all have a finite life. When we're not there, we have to plan our absence and make sure that the transition of these liabilities and assets are in the smoothest fashion to the next person who's going to take it forward. I think that will be more of the entire summary of financial.
So when and how does one start planning the finances? I mean, most of us think that you're too early to ever start saving, right? I mean, most of us think you're going to be young for eternity. Reality, I know, is very different, but most of us are delusional. So when do you think is the right time to start taking this seriously and planning your finances?
See, I think you rightly pointed out that it takes a back seat when you're in the initial stage of earning money. You are trying to make sure that you make best use of the money you get, and your spending is the priority. So in my opinion, a person, when he starts earning or starts spending, either way he needs to start financial planning the time he starts earning. So the first rupee in your pocket should be the date on which you start planning of how you will traverse this journey of wealth creation and also expenditure. So the more you plan your finances, the more you have money to live those experiences which you today want to live as an individual.
And how much money do you save? I know Warren Buffett very famously says that you need to spend after you put your money aside towards saving. I don't know how true that sounds, or how true that stands in practicality. So how much money does one need to assign towards saving monthly, annually, quarterly, whatever is advisable?
See, I think, like you rightly said, Warren Buffett said that you spend after you've saved enough.
Yeah.
But I think it's easier said than done.
Yeah.
But if you look at how you measure yourself against the entire nation, so if you think of the medium strata, not the lower strata, about 30 to 32% of the total income is being saved today. So if I was trying to see what's my saving potential, I would look at the average and then see if I can be above average shifts so that I can live a better life in the later half of it.
And I think as Indian citizens, most of us have an ability to save a lot more than other nationalities, I believe. I guess that's just the way we're built, right?
Absolutely.
Feroze, I don't know whether this is a sense that you get as well from clients, from individuals that you meet. I mean, we as individuals might watch a show like this and consider, oh, we got to go back and financial plan. But we get caught up in our day-to-day chores. We don't have the experience. A lot of times we don't have the time, the ability to sit back and plan our own finances. Of course, we can go up to doing budgeting, but beyond that, it's a dark hole. Is it important in your mind to take advice or help of a professional financial advisor to get this pat down right?
I think, like we discussed, it's a very significant part of one's life. And if you're not going to be able to spend time on it, which is what happens with most of us, because you're going to get
caught up. A lot of times you
up.
don't have the ability to do it, right?
Absolutely. I think it's twofold. One is the time to do it, and also the nuances of how to do it. I think a financial planner steps in and tries to be the catalyst to push you to do it, and also brings in the expertise. So I would definitely delegate it to a professional and not try to rediscover the wheel. And do it in not as best a fashion as a professional would. So a financial planner being a part of your life, whom you could probably start building a relationship over a period.
So he's like a financial doctor, if that's what I can call it.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's as important as your health, because financial doctor would automatically be able to...
financial health.
Absolutely.
And you're right, because products are also changing by the day. We talked about it a few years ago. It was all about real estate. It was about fixed deposits. And now when you look at the gamut of options available, you go from mutual funds, from into debt, equity, sectoral funds. There's so much more available out there. So I guess advice from a professional advisor is what's most important. Okay, let's break this down, because we'll have to help our viewers determine what are the key aspects of financial planning. So if I had to ask you for an overview, in your mind, break this down for me, the key aspects of financial planning.
See, if you break them down into three broad heads, one is the creation of wealth, which is the most tangible objective, which is money. The second part of financial planning is protecting yourself against all the possible risks which could come this way in this journey of making money and actually spending it. And the last one is to transmit the strategy and also the wealth and the liabilities sometimes, and making sure that all these three heads are taken care of. So three heads: wealth creation, protection, and transmission in the broader categories would be how financial planning would be spaced.
Well, yes, on that note, we'll take a quick break. We'll come back and, of course, continue our conversation with Feroze Azeez. We'll take you through every aspect of financial planning over the next couple of minutes, so stay tuned. Welcome back. You're watching Financial Plan, and I'm in conversation with Feroze Azeez of Anand Rathi. Thanks, Feroze, for hanging in there. Feroze, just to get started, before we took this break, we talked about the importance of wealth creation. We all work very hard for our money, so I guess it's important for the money to work for us as well. Do you agree?
Absolutely, absolutely. Over a period of time, money becomes large enough to actually repay for all the effort you've put in to get them into your bank account. So,
Feroze, let's start by taking a very holistic view on what are the key checkpoints that we need to keep in mind while we work towards creating this wealth. Firstly, we need to determine what is one's net worth, I believe, right? How do you determine net worth? I mean, is a personal balance sheet exactly like what it is for a company?
Yeah, it's not as complex as it's for a company, but I think drawing up the balance sheet is the most important first step. If you don't know your point A, you would not be able to define a point B and move from point A to point B. So the first point is to find out where you are, find out all the assets you have, all the liabilities you have, and then draw up a balance sheet and understand the difference between these two, which is your net worth. So that's the first very, very important step, because if you don't know where you start, you might not be very clear of where you're going.
Well, Feroze, we all know that over a period of time, if money is just left, it loses value on back of inflation. Can you take us through why inflation is a factor that we need to keep in mind? So it's not about the WPI and CPI data that the government tracks only, right?
Correct. I think inflation, again, which is nothing but phenomena where your money keeps eroding itself over a period because it's losing value, especially in India, where you are speaking of higher interest rate, high inflation, mehengai, price rise, all synonyms to the same thing, actually erode your money on a daily basis.
So 100 rupees today is not going to be 100 rupees 10 years later.
Absolutely not. And if we did a research to aggregate all the last 30 years of inflation, and if a person had left a 100 rupee note unattended, its value would be about 5 rupees, as per the government's inflation published over the last 30 years aggregated. So inflation could have eroded 95% of one's wealth, and that's one of the biggest risks you could actually envisage. Like, for example, after demonetization, people discovered a lot of money in lockers, unattended. That's actually deteriorating in value every day because it's happening in a very small quantum. You're not able to realize the depletion.
Right. Talk about how does one determine how much money you would need? So it's not easy or probably not so difficult to say that you might need an X amount of money 20 years later, throwing a number off your hat. But that's not the right way to do it, right?
Correct, absolutely. See, what happens is you will have to actually find out the value of money at that point in time. So, point one, if a person wants 100 rupees today, okay, and looking at how inflation has panned out over the last 10 years, if he wants to figure out how much would he need 10 years from now, if I gave a thumb rule rather than a scientific calculator, you could actually double it every 10 years. So after 10 years, if 7% is the inflation, if you assumed, and if that's the assumption, then if you needed 100 today, and then you need 200 after 10 years, and 400 after 20 years. Okay. So now, first question when you're trying to envisage what you would need is to ask yourself what you would need today. Multiply it into 2 to get it after 10 years as the number you would need after 10 years.
To maintain your current lifestyle. This is not aspirational.
This is not aspirational. This is the current
life. So just continue to live the way you live today. 10 years later, you would need to, of course, double that up.
Absolutely, every 10 years. And that's a very, very valid point you said. Aspirational. Most human beings like to upgrade their lifestyles. They don't want to consume what they were consuming 10 years back. And that's inflation over and above that. So that actually puts more pressure on the money because you are aspiring to live a better life.
So this brings me to setting goals, right? I mean, yes, there are aspirations on one hand, and on the other there are realistic expectations, which you have to plan for. That comes down to setting your goals. So 10 years later, 20 years later, 30 years later, how does one determine what your goals are? Is it very ad hoc? Is it arbitrary in nature? Or is there a lot of planning that goes into identifying these goals?
See, I think goals are of course to be broken into from a time frame perspective. It needs to be categorized as short term, medium term, and long term. And from a priority perspective, which is more important, is to see which are the must have and the ones which are good to have, like education.
So are goals a function of life cycle then?
Absolutely, they are. So I think you have to first prioritize your goals. There's some which are certain to be coming to you. Retirement, for example, which actually is the last priority of one person, especially during young age, is the most important. Child's education, maybe he might fund himself, right, 20 years from now, but retirement, I don't think there's somebody else going to fund my retirement. So retirement becomes a very important goal. So that's a must-have goal, for example. Children's marriage and education, of course, are important things and milestones in one's life, and that's important. There are some which are good to have, for example, travel, and if you know recreation, and all that can actually be made live without. So classify them as very important to have, and the ones which are good to have. So the good to have objectives should take a back seat after you have set aside money to make sure that all the ones which you will surely have to fulfill, those are taken care of.
Feroze, also while we prioritize goals on how important they are in our lives, is there some way of prioritizing goals that are nearer in nature? So a goal which is 10 years down the line becomes more important than the one that's 30 years later?
Absolutely, yes. Because like you rightly said, salaries go up and nobody would actually be able to envisage what he's going to earn 10 years from now. So now if there's a goal which is just 5 years away, you have to make do with what salaries you get. So you're giving priority to the one which is just 5 years away. It's perfectly fine. But if you're going overboard to spend on something which is going to create a dent on your long-term goal, then that might not be very wise. So it's a thin line between trying to meet your short-term goals, but not the ones ones which are very flamboyant and which you can't afford at all. So.
Yeah.
That needs to be taken care
And I
of.
think, Feroze, I'm guessing your risk-taking ability usually depends on how old you are, what your salary is, what goals you have, what liabilities you have. Is that an important area? Because it's not, it's not one color that fits all, one that fits all sort of model.
Absolutely. This is one space where a financial planner really comes handy to find out what's your risk appetite. Risk appetite is your capability to handle uncertainties. If there are uncertainties and if you're not able to handle those uncertainties, you as an individual are lower on risk appetite. Sometimes what happens is age might not have that strong a correlation with your risk appetite. A person who's actually a conservative guy might remain conservative even at the young age, and he might live that way entire life. So it's a financial planner who will be able to understand your capacity to take stress in a portfolio and handle the volatility which generally investments take you through during the short run. In the long run, they are all good, but you have to live the short run to be able to reach the long run. And I think that's when you need some degree of hand-holding by a financial planner who can traverse this path of short term to bring you to the long term.
Feroze, in financial planning is not a one-off area that you address once every few years, right? I would imagine this is an ongoing process. We've got to keep engaging with your advisor, try and understand whether or not your investments are generating the returns that you would like, whether or not your assets or your goals are getting changed. Very evolving, very ongoing in that nature, right?
Again, very right, Samina. I think because the variables you're dealing with could be your income, your expenses, markets, asset classes, risk appetite, all these are changing. All the variables are changing which involve. So it can't be a static, discrete process where you do it, put it and then shut it. So it has to be an ongoing analog process where you're going through this journey and traversing it. As things change, you're changing as well to make sure the plan is always contemporary.
So how often do you recommend one needs to monitor or sort of review their financial plan?
See, in my opinion, there are large changes which happen in balance sheets in a year's time. So I would say that a serious review every year to not just try and see whether you are accommodating all these new assets and liabilities, but also to see whether you're going in the direction of meeting the goal. If you realize that you're not in the path of actually achieving your objective, then you will be able to course correct. And I think that's the most important thing which people fail to do. It's not about making mistakes. It's inevitable that you will. It's about making sure that you don't live with those mistakes for far too long that it creates a dent on your plan and make sure that your objective is not met.
Well, those are the key aspects of wealth creation. We'll take a quick break. We'll come back. We'll talk about how it's important to protect your wealth and also transmit it further. So stay tuned. Welcome back. You're watching Financial Planner and we're in conversation with Feroze Azeez. Feroze, in the first segment we talked about how we should create wealth and of course make our money work for us. One important aspect of that is also setting your goals. There are some goals that we can foresee, and of course every time you review your financial balance sheet or financial plan, some goals can be added or subtracted. But what we don't often plan for is uncertainty. There are unfortunate events that happen in most people's lives which we are never ready or prepared for. I know you can never emotionally be ready for it, but financially, I guess, is there some way to ensure that you're mitigating a risk that we all stand at?
Right. I think risk is a very broader term. Unfortunately, people immediately think of market risk and price risk, which all these assets go through. But risk is far beyond that. Market risk is a very small component of risk. What could be the risk? So if you have liabilities and your assets, there's a mismatch. There's a risk of dying too soon and leaving your dependents with more liabilities than assets. So mitigating that's an important part. Second, if you actually have medical expenses, like you said, this path might have some surprises. God might have surprises for you during this journey. And if you realize that there is a medical expense, which is some critical illness, and if that's going to create an emotional trauma and also a financial stress on your savings and put all your financial goals at stake, then I think it's not a good idea. So can you mitigate it? The answer is yes. Now, sometimes what happens is God has got something very, very unplanned, and if there's a disability which actually keeps you unemployed for long periods of time, and so can you mitigate that? Yes, you should. Sometimes you lose a job job? Is there a possibility to actually protect yourself and make sure that your plans are still in place if you actually lost your job during recessions and stuff? And then lastly, there, in a country like ours where we have a lot of litigation pending, if there is litigation and liability on you possible, is there methods to actually mitigate that risk? I think I've just explained about 4 or 5 of them.
Right.
But all the risks need to be mitigated because that's the only thing you control.
Right.
Returns are going to be dependent on the external factors. But risk is something which is your variable. And if you don't control that, then I think it's
Feroze,
undone.
how do we quantify these risks? So how much of your corpus should be earmarked towards dealing with risk or mitigating risk or protecting yourself against these unforeseen circumstances that could hit you anytime?
See, the good part is risks are a very low probability event. Okay, like you said, there are risks, of course, but since the probability that it comes to each of us is very low, the cost you spend to mitigate them is minuscule as well. So that's exactly makes it even more important because you can mitigate large risks of low probability with very little money set aside. Now, for example, if you have assets and liabilities, if your assets are lesser and your liabilities are more, and if you have dependents depending on you, you have to cover your life. So the extent of the difference needs to be covered by life insurance, for example. So at the age of 35, you're able to get a 1 crore cover at as little as 15 to 20,000 rupees a year, right? And even if you end up paying this, mitigating this for 30 years, you will end up paying 6 lakh rupees. And that's very little cost to pay to make sure that your dependents don't go through an emotional and a financial trauma at once.
Right, Feroze, another aspects, we've talked about creating wealth and protecting it. What happens to transferring it to the next generation? How important is this? Because more often than not, even if there's a lot of wealth left, sometimes it's stuck in litigation, which you already referred to in our previous conversation. So to avoid all that, how do you make the process seamless of transferring wealth from one generation to another?
I think this is one place where psychologically it's very difficult to think. Most human beings are not able to come to terms with the fact that we all have a finite life. And planning for it it's become a very rare phenomena. So I think, and it's 100%, this is 100% probability. Risk might have low probability, but this is 100% probability. For an event which is sure to happen, not planning for it, we plan the least. So it should be done. How does it get done? In India, it's actually reasonably complex, so that makes it more important for you to do, right? You have to have registered wills, you have to have transparency to your will, it needs to have clear documentation, it needs to have a modification if there are nominations not syncing with your investments. Your entire will can go for a probate, which is nothing but a court order to dismantle your assets, and that can take you a year. In that 1 year period, you can make no changes to the assets. When you see a lot of people running pillar to post to access their own parents' money or spouse's money, then you think it's ironical that the person actually earned that money in 10 years, 5 years, 20 years, and couldn't spend about 5 hours to make sure that that was seamlessly transmitted.
So all that wealth creation, protection nullifies if there's no transmission or transferring this to the people who you're doing this for, right?
Absolutely. I think it'll be ironical if you don't plan the last step.
I know this is a tough one, but when does one need to start worrying about this? Is it related to your life cycle again?
See, I think more so younger people need to plan for this. Surprisingly, when I've seen situations where a younger person suddenly has not been able to live that longer as he envisaged, what he is left behind is far more messier than a person who's 75 years old, because he's already come to terms that he is in the last lap of life maybe. But a person who's 30, and if there's a sudden demise, there's so much left undone. So I think younger people who have liabilities, especially who have liabilities, need to plan this.
Yeah, because it's not just about inheriting wealth, it's also about inheriting liabilities that you will end up doing.
One important part is when you actually have yourself insured, and if there is a liability, if you have an insurance and if you have a sudden demise, you get the money, but the money needs to be managed very well till the goals arrive. You can't get your child married at a younger age just because you've
got the money sitting there.
So giving the capability to the dependent to manage the money is as important as giving the money itself. So you'll have to train the next generation or train the spouse enough to be able to handle this extra money which you've got and make sure that it's working till the goals actually arrive to get met.
So for whatever it is, financial planning is a serious business, right? But thanks, Feroze. Good talking to you this evening. With that, it's a wrap on this edition of Financial Planner. Thanks for watching.